A good Erev Shabbos. Someone who had a great influence on me in yeshiva told a story once. She said there's these two people walking down a road and they see a little figure near the ground at the end of the trail in the shadows. So one says, "Look, it's a cat." The other says, "No, it's a bird." They argue about it for a while back and forth, and they decide to bring in a little science. They'll throw a rock and they'll see how the figure flees. So they toss this rock down the lane, and the little figure at the end of the road flaps its wings, takes off in the air, and the first person says, "Well, I'll be. That's the first time in my life I ever saw a cat fly." It's a funny line, because we see that in ourselves. We usually find what we're looking for. Call it confirmation bias, call it stubbornness or self-fulfilling prophecy, call it, "I've made up my mind, please don't confuse me with the facts." Our parsha this week has that element in it, and it also calls to our attention that we do the very same thing. Yet our sages believe in us, maybe sometimes more than we do ourselves, and they tell us that we're not prisoners of our perceptions. We can and we do have the ability and wherewithal to make rational and wise decisions. The major narrative at the beginning of Parsha Shelach is the story of the spies. Before entering into the land of Israel, God tells Moshe to tell the Jewish people that they might send spies into Israel. And we're careful to emphasize the Shelach Lecha, there for you, because you, people, like to have evidence-based thinking. So send spies to reconnoiter the land, and they'll bring back a report of how the land is to be conquered and settled as a Jewish homeland. Fine. The expedition does not go as well as it might have. 10 of the 12 spies come back with a panicked report, doubtful if Bnei Yisrael will actually be able to complete this mission on which God has sent us. The other two, in stark contrast, return full of optimism with a positive outlook. We can go into depth into those different points of view, and we will another time, to see how the frame of mind with which they entered into the mission had a lot to do with ultimately what results they found. For 2,000 years of exile, rounding up to the nearest century, the Jewish people had longed to return home to Israel. We prayed, we asked, we hoped, we remembered, mourned the loss, and anticipated the return. For the last 7 decades, rounding down to the nearest decade, we have had, in some form or another, the opportunity to do just that, to return to a sovereign state of Israel, where Jews from anywhere on the planet are welcomed home and granted citizenship simply by virtue of our Jewishness. Okay, fine, there's a little paperwork, but we have to keep the bureaucrats working, don't we? One noteworthy thing about this situation is that, if you notice, while you do find, in fact, about half the Jewish people living in Israel, living their lives in the Promised Land, you will also find about half of the Jewish people living outside the land, in Canada, America, South Africa, France, the UK, a few other locales. In other words, it has not been clear to about half of us that we should, in fact, head back home, get back to the Holy Land. Now, how can that be? Reading through the Chumash, for that matter the whole Tanakh, it seems pretty clear where the Jews are meant to be. So how can so many of us still not be there? Let's refer ourselves back to the original point about confirmation bias and finding what you're looking for. Parsha Shelach should stand much closer to the end of the Torah narrative than it actually does. The spies, the scouts, Meragelim in this parsha should have gone in to check out Israel and come back and said, "All's good, falafel ahead, yalla, let's go." And we would have traveled a few more days and been home. Spoiler alert, it did not happen that way. And we got 40 more years of desert, we got Korach, we got Balak, and we got a lot of sand in our sandals. Even though God had in fact been leading us to this promised land for generations, somehow it was not entirely clear to the majority of this reconnaissance team, most of them, that this was it. How much clearer can you be when God tells you the story for generations, then takes you there and says, "Okay, Chevra, get ready to go up, get ready to ascend, go on Aliyah to the promised land"? I guess you can never be too clear. So the decree was pronounced by God that we would have to wait another 40 years until we got another chance. There's a small but significant historical footnote right in the parsha at the end of chapter 14. If you take a look, the story of the Ma'apilim If you miss it in this week's Parsha, don't worry, you'll get another chance in Parshas Devarim a couple weeks down the road. These zealots said, no, we're ready to go now. We don't want to wait another 40 years. Let's go. By then it was too late. You can't chart your own course. You have to stick with Amcha. These Ma'apilim bravely attempt to enter the land of Israel right away, and sadly enough, are cut down by their adversaries. Okay, so which one is it? Are we supposed to yes go to Israel? Are we supposed to not go to Israel? What's the lesson here? We seem to be getting a mixed message at best. This debate plays out over centuries in the Gemara and Ksubas of the Gimel Shavuos, the 3 oaths that supposedly preclude immigration to Israel en masse, according to some segments of a certain religious zealotry. We might call them the Zionist hesitant Jews who feel that only the Messiah can take us there. And while other Jews feel that it's good enough to go to Israel, although apparently half of us feel that now is not exactly the right time, yet. So in this very Parsha, you have whatever you're looking for. If you want to find strong evidence to go, look in Parsha Shelach. If you want to find out what happens to people who jump the gun and go to Israel before it's time, look in Parsha Shelach. You could read this Parsha and you could internalize the lesson and still wind up right where you were when you started. But hopefully, at least, you could be a little bit wiser than when you began. So let's not talk about when to enter Israel, let's talk about how to enter Israel. Take 2 pieces of evidence as guideposts. The Torah says in the opening verses of this Parsha, send scouts, vayaturu es eretz Canaan. They will reconnoiter the land. And later, after listing their names, it says that Moshe sent them to check out the land of Canaan, vayishlach Isam Moshe latur es eretz Canaan, to have a look. But hold on to latur and vayatura for half a second. Indeed, right after that incident, we learn about the mitzvah of taking challah. It looks out of place unless you can put one and one together. Latur and vayaturu sound a lot like Torah, because they're from the same root. And the mitzvah of challah is really precisely what sets apart life in Israel from life in the desert. In the desert, you eat manna, and you say, hamotzi lechem min hashamayim. Once you come into Israel, you eat challah, but not until you settle the land and divide it up and plow it and plant it, water, harvest, thresh, winnow, grind, mix, knead, and bake it. And then you wash your hands and you say, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. It's a lot more work, and some suggest that this is why we were so hesitant. Much easier to have Uber Eats from the Uberster than actually grow and bake your own bread. But in the end, it's much more rewarding in so many ways. You work it yourself, and you give some of it as an offering. You share some with God. You share some with the Leviim, the Kohanim. Everyone benefits. That's how you do it. In other words, we talk about Aliyah to Israel as ascent, in elevation for sure, but even more so in spiritual elevation. Going to Israel is supposed to elevate us, vault us to a higher plane, a more thoroughly Jewish existence, a more fulfilled Jewish life. So, while the rest of us sit here and try to figure it out, let's wish our dear friends Guy and Danielle Weisberg Tzeitchem L'Shalom. As they go on that ascent, they are making Aliyah to Israel this week. They've been such a precious part of our Kehillah over the time they've been in Toronto in so many ways, educating the community, serving on the board, leading services. We will truly miss them, and we wish them every success as they go up. We're also marking another momentous event this Shabbat. It's a year late in public celebration due to COVID, but our daughter Shayna is celebrating her bas mitzvah with family and friends this weekend. Her 12th birthday was over a year ago, and in preparation for that great event, that milestone moment, she undertook to study the entire Tanakh, all 929 chapters of the Hebrew Bible, and she made a siyum, which she'll share a little bit of it with us after davening this Shabbos. Everyone is invited to partake in that. Maimonides writes in the Laws of Repentance, Hilchos Tshuva, that each of us can be as righteous as Moshe, as Moses, and as wicked as Yeravam ben Nevat. There's nothing that predetermines our actions. In fact, this is the basis of the entire Torah, that we have free choice and we can determine what our actions will be. If it were any other way, we wouldn't be culpable for our transgressions, nor would we earn reward for our mitzvahs. In fact, there's 2 types of choice that we're called upon to make. The first is the obvious. Here's kosher food, will you choose it? Here's Shabbat, will you turn off your phone? Here's Pesach, will you clean the chametz out of your home and out of your heart? There are distractions, there's temptations, many things seemingly large and small that stand in the way. Nevertheless, we're offered the opportunity for mitzvahs to make good choices every day of our lives. And then there's the area of our lives in which we're not specifically commanded. Call it our free time, our divrei reshus, our many options that stretch in front of us. What kind of choices will we make? What will we do with the time that's given to us to do with whatever we please? How will we formulate our worldview so that we want good things that are good for us and good at the world? How do we recognize that even though something that looks like more work, maybe we could avoid it? Let's say, for example, entering the land of Israel and working it through the sweat of our brow rather than just enjoying bread from the heavens every day. Nevertheless, that's what we're here for, to respect and love and work the land, to choose it, to choose life, enjoy its benefits. And after we've gone into Israel and we've taken Trumas and Maisaras and Chalas and obtained our sustenance in accordance with all the other mitzvahs Hatuluyas Ba'aretz, we learned in Pirkei Avos, Lefum Tzara Agra, the reward is commensurate with the effort expended. The shorthand form of that is you get out of it what you put into it. While some from our shul are actually moving to Israel and becoming Israeli citizens, it's really fitting for all of us to see ourselves and conduct ourselves as B'nai Aliyah, people who are on the ascent, asking more of ourselves, putting more effort into good things, always raising the bar for ourselves and setting new standards wherever we are. At this great moment in the life, in the moment of transition, in the life of a bat mitzvah or in the life of a family deciding to continue its life in the promised land, we can all take inspiration from the good things we see around us and make the most out of every opportunity to seek out the land wherever we are and to turn it into something even better than we find it. May we all continue to inspire each other and challenge each other in a spirit of growth and always in good health and besimcha. Good Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom, Tzeitchem L'Shalom, and Mazel Tov.